Have you ever vowed to God or to someone you love and then watched the promise slowly break down? Words that are left unkept can erode trust and warp our spiritual integrity. And in Numbers chapter 30, we'll unpack vows, restrictions, and who carries the weight of spoken promises. And I'll give you one immediate action to restore integrity in your speech this week, and how to move from casual promises to faithful words in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's get a little bit of context into this chapter. Okay, so Numbers chapter 30 lays down the rules for vows and oaths, how men and women make promises, when vows can be confirmed or annulled, and the social and familial structures that govern spoken commitments. If you're following the series, this chapter follows the sacred calendar that we saw in Numbers chapter 29 and moves from public rhythm to private speech. God cares about both the way we mark time and the way we shape our words. Okay, so let's read verses 1 to 5. This is going to be about vows made by men and the personal responsibility associated with that. And my question to you is, who bears the responsibility when you make a vow? Your conscience, God, or someone else? Verse 1. Then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the Israelites, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. When a woman makes a vow to the Lord or binds herself by a pledge while within her father's house in her youth, and her father hears of her vow or her pledge by which she has bound herself and says nothing on her, then all her vows shall stand, and any pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father overrules her at the time that he hears of it, no vow of hers and no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her because her father overruled her." Okay, biblical unlock number 1. So the question here is, if I vow something, is it automatically binding? The answer to that question is actually yes, because spoken vows are something which are taken very seriously. The chapter begins by insisting that when a man vows, he must carry it out, that words have moral weight before God and before the community. This is something that is actually reiterated in the New Testament as well by Jesus during his Sermon on the Mount, where people would swear by God's temple or swear by God's reputation in order to procure something that they wish, right? And Jesus takes this logic to its final conclusion, saying, "Do not swear by anything at all. Let your yes be yes and your no be no." And we'll read this later as the Christological fulfillment. But the idea here is oaths matter, what you say matters, and that death and life are both in the power of the tongue. Now, right at the end of these series of 5 verses, we see that a father can overrule a daughter at the time that he hears of it, but no vow of hers and no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we add on the context of verses 6 to 8. So let's read verse 6 to 8 now. Why would a father be allowed to annul a daughter's vow? And what does this say about social vulnerability? Let's read. Verse 6. If she marries while obligated by her vows, or any thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she has bound herself, and her husband hears of it, and says nothing to her at the time that he hears of it, then her vows shall stand, and her pledges by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if, at the time that her husband hears of it, he overrules her, then he shall nullify the vow by which she was obligated, or the thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. Okay, biblical unlock number 2. Why can a father annul a daughter's vow? Isn't that unfair? This rule protects, and it was instituted during the ancient Near East. Whenever you see a law which seems to be incompatible with contemporary moral ethics, you need to ask yourself, who was this law intended for? Why might it have been used? Why might it have been used in that particular context? The rule protected, vulnerable dependence. In the ancient context, women often lacked full legal autonomy, and the father's right to confirm or annul is actually a social safeguard, even if it may seem flawed, and it is actually intended to prevent impulsive promises that could harm a household. We can also see this sort of idea in Leviticus chapter 27, right at the end of Leviticus, how a person's oaths are really important. And if a person makes a harsh or rash oath, right, a father can annul it or nullify it to protect his household. Okay, let's also read verses 9 to 16, which is going to be the end of this chapter. Verses 9 to 15 are going to concern themselves with a husband's confirmation or nullifying of his wife's vow. And my question to you is to stay engaged in this section is, how does marriage affect the binding nature of a spouse's promises? Verse 9, we read, "But every vow of a widow or of a divorced woman by which she has bound herself shall be binding upon her." Verse 10, "And if she made a vow in her husband's house or bound herself by a pledge with an oath, and her husband heard it and said nothing to her and did not overrule her, then all her vows shall stand, and any pledge by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband nullifies them at the time that he hears them, then whatever proceeds out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning her pledge shall not stand. Her husband has nullified them, and the Lord will forgive her. Any vow or any binding oath to humble herself, her husband may allow to stand, or her husband may nullify. But if her husband says nothing to her from day to day, then he validates all her vows or all her pledges by which she is obligated. He has validated them because he said nothing to her at the time that he heard them. But if he nullifies them some time after he has heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. These are the statutes that the Lord commanded Moses concerning a husband and his wife, and a father and his daughter while she is still young and in her father's house." Alright, final biblical unlock, number 3. Does marriage cancel a spouse's moral agency? The text here actually distinguishes between private and public authority. A husband's confirmation can bind a wife's vow, but the principle aims at household order, not erasing conscience. And the chapter also stresses timely speech, and that if you delay your annulment, like for example if the wife makes a vow and the husband doesn't say anything, but then later sees the consequences of the vow and then nullifies it, then he also bears some consequences. Now, this particular passage can seem to imply that husbands have a greater moral worth or moral agency over their wives, and to a certain extent this is true, but not in a oppressive or repressive way. For example, in Colossians chapter 3 verse 18 we read, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." Furthermore, we also see this same statement reiterated in Ephesians 5:22. "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands." Verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself in splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind, so that she may be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hates his own flesh, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I am speaking about Christ and the church. Each of you, however, should love his wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband." Okay, so with these New Testament passages, I hope you can see something really important. And the idea here is that whilst husbands do have some authority over their wives, that is not an authority like a dictatorship. That is a self-sacrifice. In the same way that Christ has authority over you, A husband should have authority over their wives in the sense that, and this is only in the sense that, they are meant to give up themselves for their wives. They are meant to die for their wives. They're meant to love them so much that they are willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of their wives. That is the level of authority. Authority in the sense that they are willing to sacrifice everything for them because of the love that they have for their wives. So, it all comes from a place of love, not from a place of oppression, not from a place of dictatorship, not from a place of authoritarianism. It all comes from a place of love. Husbands should be willing to die for their wives because Christ died for the church, and the marriage between a husband and a wife should emulate the relationship between Christ and the church. Let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. Alright, so I've already pointed out some of the most important Christological significance in this chapter, primarily through the relationship between the husband and the wife and how that is meant to emulate the relationship between Christ and the church. But the trajectory of Numbers chapter 30, from the solemnity of spoken vows to the social mechanisms that confirm or annul them, they all point forward to how Christ reorders speech and responsibility. Jesus Christ raises the moral bar. He calls for integrity without oaths and for a goodness that makes vows unnecessary because one's word is already reliable in him. At the same time, the church retains the pastoral task of protecting the vulnerable and restoring trust where speech has harmed relationships. As we read in James chapter 5 verse 12, "Above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, lest ye fall into condemnation." So this is just reiterating Jesus Christ's statement that don't swear by any oaths, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Alright, let's go through some practical applications that we can extract from this particular chapter. So the first thing is, we need to make sure that we're having integrity, right, with our promises. Whether we make big promises or small promises, you can actually reflect upon all of the promises that you've made, and for each of them, mark whether it is still true, whether it reads in renegotiation, or whether it should be publicly apologized for. Do one corrective action this week to either apologize, recommit, and mark it as true. And the reason why is because we need to be very careful about what we say. We need to be very careful about the promises that we make. We need to be very careful about what comes out of our mouths. Next thing, if you lead a small family or a group, right, you need to create a short practice before making public promises to check what you're saying. You can have one accountability partner, set a 24-hour waiting rule, and you need to stop impulsivity, because impulsivity can lead to promises which are broken. Instead, if you wait, if you have someone to discuss this with, then all of a sudden it prevents you from making rash vows. And this is really important because this is what Jesus says. Do not use God's reputation for your vows. Don't say, oh, on mum's life, on God's honor, on God, and stuff like that. Why would you use God's reputation in your vows if you're simply not going to keep them? So let your yes be yes and your no be no. Alright, well, that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. Numbers chapter 30 laid down the rules for vows and oaths, how women and men make promises, and how that ultimately fulfills Jesus Christ through his relationship with the church and a husband's relationship with his wife, as well as how our oaths are really important and that they should not be taken lightly. So, next episode we're going to go through Numbers chapter 31. We'll move from the vows to the fallout of broken promises and hard decisions that are going to occur in Numbers chapter 31, a chapter that raises the stakes of covenant life. We'll ask, how does holiness handle violence, justice, and communal purity after promises are tested? If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.